The Tim Heale Thirsty Thursday live stream from 7 until 9 weekly. Here's your host, Tim Heale.
So, without too much further ado, I'm going to bring in young Ed. So, Ed, you're in the room.
Hello. Thank you for the applause.
You're welcome. So, Ed, if you can tell us a bit about your part of in Wessex archaeology, what your job is, and how you go about it, that'd be great.
Yeah, of course. So, yeah, I'm a bit different from your previous two, so a bit different from Lo and Sam. So, I'm an environmental specialist, and that's essentially a way of saying that I look at human-environment interactions in the past. And I've got a particular sort of set of specialisms. And so I look at plant remains. So that can be sort of a plant in quite a broad botanical sense, ranging from something like a massive tree down to a really small weed. So on a day-to-day basis, I am sort of involved in that commercial aspect of our company that Lo and Sam had talked about. So I look at seeds and bits of wood that are recovered from archaeological excavations, and using those, I'm sort of interested in topics such as what crops people grew in the past, how those crops changed through time, if they were exploiting wild plant resources like hazelnuts and crab apples before farming, and if they continued doing that even after the introduction of farming. Also get interested in quite a diverse sort of range of areas. So it could range from fuel procurement for iron production. I could be looking at what the past environment just looked like at different points in time. And then because of the nature of the specialism I've got, so I'm capable of identifying bits of wood. Sometimes I'm given artifactual evidence. So recently I was identifying what wood was in a medieval axe. And those are quite nice little tangents to what I normally work on, which are what we call charred plant remains and wood charcoal. So these are sort of burnt plant remains that sort of form this background sort of noise, a bit like rubbish almost on a settlement. And they're sort of the detritus that is formed by everyday occupation. So it could be people throwing the ashes out of their fire, and then discarding it into a ditch or a pit near their settlement. It could be them accidentally burning down their house. And so that's sort of the bread and butter of what I look at. And so I think it can be quite surprising to many who aren't that involved in archaeological circles that we have specialists who focus just on plant species and things like that, because we perhaps don't get the glamour of, say, a complete pottery vessel or a piece of gold. But yeah, I'm much more interested in a seed. You can throw away the gold for what I'm interested in.
That's fascinating work that you do then. So, how do you go about identifying a bit of charcoal and where it's come from? How do you age it?
Yes, we've got quite a few methods. So people in my office joke that I hoard microscopes because I've got 3. So I've got quite a low powered one, so that goes to about 40 magnification. And then I've got 2 higher powered ones, which go to 400 and then 1000 magnification. And so one of the things that is perhaps a bit surprising about wood is that microscopically it's very identifiable. So when you take a slice of a tree, we look at sort of the distribution of vessels within it. And I won't go into the actual details of it because it's quite complicated. But essentially, by shining a very powerful light through it, we can sort of see very particular anatomical characteristics that then we can use to identify a particular wood species. And everything that I do is based off modern reference material. So I've got sort of my own axe, my own saw, and with landowners' permission and stuff like that, I quite often go around and source random bits of timber from species. So, for instance, I've got modern oak in my collection. When I find archaeological oak, I can compare the two And it could be the same in anything. It could be a piece of hazel. It could be a non-native species like Douglas fir or something like that. So it's all dependent on that, having that modern reference material. So my office is rammed with different bits of twigs, other random bits of plants, because it's not just the wood that we're looking at when we're looking at trees. Sometimes it can be the actual leaves, it can be the little tree buds. They're very identifiable, and also the seeds of better known ones. So like hazelnut shell is a classic one. And we're really interested in getting these out of archaeological sites because they provide us with a method of dating archaeological sites as well. So we can use radiocarbon dating, which is a very complicated method that measures the decay of a radioactive isotope, essentially, that accumulates in living organisms. And we can, through some complex calibration, essentially get a very accurate and absolute date for almost anything extending back about 50,000 years.
Good grief, 50,000 years.
Yeah,
That's
so
a little
well,
while
that's just
ago,
one
isn't
of
it?
our it's just one of our dating methods. There's a few out there that can go back even further than that. But
Mm.
radiocarbon dating is that's our routine. That's something we use a lot.
Mm. And do you use a special machine for that?
Yeah, so as big as Wessex is as a company, we can't afford one of them. They're multi-million-dollar piece of instruments. So we send them to external laboratories. So there's several of these in universities across the UK in particular. So we've got a little selection that we use.
Mm.
So
And I guess they obviously bill you for it.
yeah, they do.
So just if anybody's got any questions for any of the guests so far, pop them in the chat box, and when we get everybody back in, we'll have a chance to have a chat and answer your questions. So what else is involved with what you do?
So although on a day-to-day basis, I'm sort of involved in that commercial aspect of producing reports. So contributing to our client reports. So I'm just sort of one component of that cog. So for instance, I've been recently looking at Iron Age settlements. So I've been writing a report on what the landscape around that settlement looked like. How open was it? Do we have any areas for woodland? And then what crops they were growing and how they were growing them is another one we can look at. So we can look at sort of the ecology of the arable weeds that we find and get quite a detailed picture of how people were actually cultivating in the past. I find it quite a tangible way of looking at the past, because until quite recently, most people were actually farmers or engaged in food production in one way or another. And so it's nice looking at the sort of the debris that they generated on a daily basis, and how tastes and attitudes shifted through time to different crops. So in the Roman period, they were crazy about spelt wheat, which is sort of a very old form of wheat. They absolutely loved it. They were probably getting quite drunk on it, because in the late Roman period, we find a lot of evidence for them making beer from it. But then you pass on 2 or 3 centuries after the Roman period, and they've decided they don't like it anymore, and they've switched to a completely different crop. Yet, if you were to look in Germany, they still grow spelt wheat today, and they love it, and they produce very particular foodstuffs from it.
Mm.
And so, whilst we have those sort of aspects of it, of looking at the past, I increasingly, as I sort of go forward in my career, I'm really interested in the sort of relevance of the data I produce. So you can a lot of what I do is what a lot of what I do is akin to ecology. So in many respects, I could describe myself as a paleoecologist. So that's an ecologist who's looking at the past, essentially. And that's really relevant when I'll say, looking at nature conservation. So, for example, if we've got a rare habitat that we're interested in preserving. So a really nice example of this is, say, the New Forest across Hampshire. We can use archaeological data to sort of understand how that habitat developed what human impacts there were that led to its creation, and then we can feed it into this model to sort of understand how is that habitat going to change going forward as the climate changes, but also we can look at our conservation practices and we can sort of set them in a far wider historical framework and sort of understand, really understand why does that landscape look like it does, and that's something I get the most interested in. So whenever I sort of go out for a walk anywhere, I get quite interested by sort of the plants growing on the ground, but then also understanding exactly why that habitat looks the way it does, because I think there's a lot of people think our habitats in the UK are quite natural sometimes, but when we look at the archaeological evidence, we can very much say they're cultural landscapes. So like the New Forest is a classic example of a cultural landscape. It's not really natural in any sense of the word. It's something that's been so heavily crafted by human intervention, yet it has that natural look. So yeah, striving to find that relevance, that modern present day relevance in our data is really, really like keeps me very engaged. And then and in events like this and disseminating it. So I do go out giving talks. Say I've done one recently to a natural history society, which was really nice, just sort of extolling the virtues of some of the data sets we produce that people just may not be aware of sometimes.
Yeah. So looking back over sort of a period of time, can you see how crops have differed with the different temperature ranges throughout the years? So sort of 300 or 400 years ago, the climate around here was slightly different to what it is now. To sort of coming forward, can you see a change in the types of crops that were grown in our area?
Yeah, we absolutely can. So there's one really interesting area that sort of emerged in the last couple of years, and this is because of work that companies say like that Wessex do, basically generating massive data sets. So after agriculture was first introduced into the UK, that's about 4000 BC, everything was going really well. They had their cereals, they were definitely cultivating cereals, and at this time they were cultivating a cereal called emmer wheat, which is it's a bit like an ancestor of what we make pasta from. That's its closest relative. And that was going really well for about 200 to 300 years. And then there's a massive blip and it changes hugely and their crops just disappear, and what it looks like is there's a massive shift towards pastoralism instead, perhaps, or there could be a big population decrease. There's still some gaps in our data, so some of it's a bit open for interpretation. But then there's another period where there's well-known climate change, which is at the end of the Bronze Age. Again, we see quite a shift in crops around that time. So that I mentioned emmer wheat, that crop, around that time, emmer wheat gets replaced by spelt wheat. And again, that could be climatic influences because it's thought that spelt could be better adapted at growing in a wider range of cultivation conditions. And then, some of the well-known cold periods, would say in the 14th century. We sometimes struggle to get the resolution in the archaeological record we need to look at a particular century. But we do certainly see sort of changing crop preferences in response to changing climate in the past, and people doing different things in response to that climatic change. So very much like today, like they weren't trying to grow crops in unsuitable places. Yeah, at times they were growing crops in places that we now can't grow them, or we would think, wow, how on earth did they do that? Or perhaps they didn't and it was very unsuccessful and they gave up.
So I mean, is there a pattern over the centuries of the different crops and how they were grown, and or is that correlated with the changing way people lived at the time?
So some of it is definitely the way to do with the way people lived. And I'd say the Roman period is a really nice example of quite a shift. So we sort of see more agglomeration into towns, people it becoming a bit more of an urban society, and that's quite a shift from the preceding Iron Age. So, example, in the Iron Age, they tended to store a lot of their cereal grains below ground in very large pits. It's a really effective way of storing them, sort of in these, we might call them underground silos. However, with the beginning of the Roman period, that sort of almost stops, and they shift towards, say, above ground granaries. But then with some quite big implications for things like grain pests. So like the granary weevil sort of explodes into action when people start doing that, because you've literally just given it the best home it could ever hope for, a warm granary supplied with hot air, endless food supply. But also you have the military aspect. So they need to supply their armies. We know they're moving crops around. We know they're importing some crops from abroad, but we can definitely see that the effect of them moving these crops, say, to sites along Hadrian's Wall. And this sort of, I mentioned earlier, this production of beer, or rather it would be ale at that time, because they didn't have hops.
Or mead.
Yeah, mead is one. So yeah, we do find evidence for mead, quite surprisingly. There's a plant that grows near riversides, which we think they probably put in it, called meadowsweet, which is sort of this, it's quite a pretty white flower, smells very, very sweet when you go past it. We found evidence of that in the Bronze Age. But yeah, and then essentially, yeah, there's huge changes and shifts, almost entire reversals and changes in what people were growing at different points in time throughout the past. So it's very much a boom and bust at certain points to do with the population, and always what we're looking at is reflecting those wider changes in the archaeological record, so the wider political and social changes that are going on. So whether people are living in sort of fixed farmsteads, or whether they're a bit more itinerant and moving around more, or whether they're living in cities compared to rural areas. We can pick up all these sort of different traces through the nature of the evidence they look at.
Brilliant. Well, Ed, that's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating what you do. What I'm going to do is I'm going to drop you down, and then I'm going to bring in young Rachel. And then we'll bring you back a little bit later. So, Rachel, you're in the room.
Good evening.
Good evening. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Yeah, enjoying listening
Brilliant.
to Dr. Ed and all his fascinating facts.
Absolutely. So, Rachel, can you tell me what you do?
So I am a project officer for Wessex, which means that I go out and I run excavations, and then when I finish running the excavations, I come in and I write the client reports and the publications for them. So I run all sorts of sites, from excavating Victorian cemeteries in a Victorian railway works in central London, to Saxon boundaries down in Dorset, to I've worked at Stonehenge, and sort of, yeah, all across, everywhere from Anglesey down to Cornwall, across to Kent and up to Norfolk. So yeah, you name it, I've kind of had a chance to dig it up, a lot of it. Yeah, so work on a real range of sites. Field work in itself is a specialism. Understanding how to unpick a site and how to interpret that site to get the most amount of information out of that site, whilst giving the client, reasonable value for money, and being realistic about how much time and expenditure it's going to take. A proper archaeological excavation is a very expensive undertaking to do. We are part of the planning system, and our clients are expected to fund us, but we also have to be realistic. If we are too expensive, they just won't build houses on there. And there are several examples of places where, done properly, the archaeology can be preserved in situ. So we've got a site on Salisbury Plain where we found two interlocking barrow ditches which had never been seen before. They were Neolithic henges which had then been reused as barrows in the Bronze Age. And when they came to develop that site, they changed where they were going to place the houses. So that became part of their green space and is now a nice play area with a reconstruction of one of the henge monuments. And they've then, because it's sat up on a nice hillside overlooking Stonehenge, and houses that would have been put on that particular part of the land have moved to where the play area was originally designed to do. So our work is everything from that very first basis of little evaluation trenches and creating background knowledge on the sites, right through to full excavation and then writing publications for people to read, hopefully. Hopefully. Yeah. So yeah, it's the full gamut of being a fieldwork archaeologist.
Crikey. I mean, that must take an awful lot of planning to start with. So where does the planning actually start for an archaeological dig in particularly in the UK?
So in the UK, for what we do within commercial archaeology, if you've won the lottery, Tim, and you buy a nice little farm and you decide that you're going to make some money out of it and you want to put some houses on there, or a wind farm or a solar farm, you decide you want to develop it in some way. You will have discussions with your planning office, and every planning office will have, so all the counties have dedicated planning archaeologists who know their county or their area, and they'll know it very well. And they will look at those planning applications and decide on what they think is a reasonable way moving forward. These can often be staged. So they can start off with, they can say, we want some more background knowledge on the site. And going from there, they will then say may want geophysical survey. Based on that, they will normally want evaluation trenches, where we will go in and we'll sample typically sort of 4 to 6% of the site, either in a very set sort of pattern, random pattern, so just sort of everything north, south, and east, west. Or if it's had a geophysical survey and we found anomalies that we're interested in, we would target the trenches on those, and then based on that, we would then move forward into an excavation strategy. And at each stage of those, so with our evaluations and with our excavations, we have to produce planning documents called written schemes of investigation. And these written schemes of investigation, we produce them, but they have to go to our client and to the planning archaeologist, and they have to be agreed by all the parties. So everybody knows where they stand. Everyone knows the scope of the work we're doing, what's going to happen if we find human remains, what will happen if we find treasure, what will happen if we find more archaeology than we're anticipating, where our boundaries and limits are, and also how we're going to progress this through into the post-excavation phase. And once we've done, so if we take a site where we've gone out, we've done a geophysical, as I can think of one that's not too far from you guys, down at Botley in Hampshire, down on the south there. So Botley bypass, they're putting a new road in and they are putting houses on next to the road. So probably about 10 years ago, we went and did some desk-based assessment. So we wrote a document that described all the archaeology then up by geophysical survey. So colleagues from Geophys went and scanned all of the ground. And based on those scanned results, we then did a targeted evaluation where we looked at potential features. Based on those, we then came back and did our targeted excavations where we found some Roman working sites, we found some Roman field boundary ditches, we had some watering holes and a not an urn cremation. We had an inverted urn that had the potential to be a cremation but didn't have any cremated remains in it. And they're not unusual to find these urns that have sort of been put in, and we think they were possibly marker boundaries. So we went in and we did all of those, but with each one we've gone back and we've produced a report. We then for the next phase of work we produce a written scheme of investigation which is agreed by all parties. So after the evaluation We came in, we wrote the report. Based on that, we produced a written scheme of investigation, which was agreed by all parties. We then went out, we did the excavation, we came back in, and we then do what's called a post-excavation assessment and updated project design, which is where we assess everything we found from the evaluation and from the excavation, and we update. So we come up with a formal report that's quite detailed and I wouldn't say formulaic, but it's very specific about what it's telling us. It's very much about assessing exactly, this is what we have. These are the types of ditches. These are the dates of these ditches. And based on that, we then come up with an updated project design. So if we found deposits that have got a lot of charcoal, and Ed's seen them and has said, oh, you've got some nice charcoal deposits and I'd like to do some radiocarbon dates on them, we will then have this updated project design where we will go back to the client and say, based on what we've done, we would like to do radiocarbon dates, and we'd like to look at these pottery forms or vessels more. And based on that, we then produce those results. We then produce the publication. So it's very much a staged process, with time taken between each stage to carefully plan. If we find something very exciting in the evaluation, that's the client's chance to then turn around and decide if they want to mitigate by preservation in situ and moving. So the Bulford example is one where they took what we'd found. We excavated a Saxon cemetery on that site, but they moved the houses so that they could preserve in situ these two really unique henge barrow features that were interlocking. So it gives everyone a chance, a breathing stage, to assess what we've got from each one and to move forward. So that's very much how archaeology works within the planning system, which is 99% of the work we do is the client-based work. From an amateur point of view, I started digging with an amateur group. They had employed a university to provide their expertise, so that they had professional expertise on site to make sure that the excavation was done to a high standard. And we don't have legislation in this country that stops people from going out and running amateur excavations, and I volunteered on quite a few. Some have been very, very well run. There's some really excellent work done by amateur archaeologists looking at sites that are not threatened by development but are interesting. And I've worked on some that are interesting, shall we say. So, but there's nothing. You could set your own archaeology group up, and you could, with the landowner's permission, you could go out and dig, as long as it's not a scheduled site. There's very little protection for sites in the UK beyond sites that are scheduled monuments and sites covered by the Treasure Act or with human remains. So if you've got a Roman villa hiding in your back garden there, Tim, and you want to dig it up, you can set a little group up and off you go.
Get the shovels out.
Yeah, literally. I've got a project that's going on at the moment. That's my own personal little thing. It was flagged to me by a friend who's a metal detectorist. He had permission from the landowner to dig. He started to find some interesting bits and pieces. We've been up and we started to do some field walking, and we've kept all the relevant authorities informed. So we've been liaising with our local portable antiquity scheme, our local finds liaison officer, to make sure all the metal detected finds are reported. We've been out and we've done field walking, and I've got a lovely database with everything we've recorded. We recorded with what 3 words, so that we've got GPS locations on all the bits of brick and CBM we found. And we're going to slowly move forward. It's a massive field. It'll be a long ongoing site, but it's something that when the crop's off, we will go out with a team of 10, 15 volunteers on a weekend and systematically start walking the field and see if we can pinpoint areas of interest. We're also in discussions with the county archaeologist, but this particular potential site is in an area of outstanding natural beauty and is unlikely to ever be threatened by development. Well, never say never, but highly, highly unlikely to be threatened by development. It could be threatened by farming, but it's not one that's really under any commercial threat. in the foreseeable future. But it's an
Wow.
interesting site, and it's local people's history and archaeology, and it belongs to them as much as it does to us. The landowner's very engaged and involved and keen for us to have a look. So that's what, that's something I do on the weekends because, I love my job.
Do in your spare time your day job.
Well, I try
Fantastic.
occasionally, yeah, I do try and find time for my husband and my dogs, but yeah, it's just the occasional
It's
weekend.
amazing how much is actually involved.
Yeah.
I mean, the average Joe on the street just hasn't got a clue how much work is actually involved in just doing a survey to start with.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rachel.
You're welcome.
Just going to drop you down now and say thanks, and then I'll do a quick.
The Tim Heale Thirsty Thursday live stream from 7 until 9 weekly.